All right, guys, let's talk about 2022 real quick, because I think that in 2022, the food crisis is going to become extremely real to most people in the United States. For the past 2 years, during the pandemic, we did see some shortages for several months. But since the pandemic, we've seen spot shortages of food supplies throughout the year in different places, almost as if, we just decided to deliver to one area. It's not widespread. It's not talked about very much, but it is happening. You see it happening. If you've been paying attention to your grocery store on a regular basis, you may notice periods of time where they're just out of certain things. They're low on chicken, they're low on beef, or they're low on milk, or they're low on vegetables. Vegetables are the big thing this year. We're going to be low on a lot of produce going into the fall. We've also seen spot shortages in countries around the world. The UK has had a lot of food shortages lately, massive empty shelves. If you pay attention to news in the other side of the world, then you've probably seen a lot of pictures of these empty shelves. And it's been blamed a lot on the new vaccine identifications and things like that. But these are food shortages that I think are linked to other things. And whatever we want to put blame on, we'll put blame on it. We'll blame it on the Brexit, right? But we've seen food shortages in China, food shortages in South America, food shortages in Cuba. And we know what's happened in South America and Cuba. When things get bad, people have nothing else to lose. South Africa and Cuba are prime examples of what happens. The reason why I think 2022 is going to be a really bad year for us is because when we look at the impacts that we've had from La Nina in 2021, these impacts have been lasting impacts. We've seen entire orchards wiped out, orchards that take years to grow. We've seen field crops like asparagus that also take years to grow completely wiped out. Throughout the West and Midwest, we have seen massive crop losses. We also saw a lot of freezes going into the late spring, early spring, like down in Texas, that affected produce and crops down there. And we've lost a lot of citrus plants. We lost a lot of citrus trees in some of those freezes. So these are lasting impacts. They're not just impacts from this year, but it had a massive impact. All of these things that happened, all of these weather events that have occurred are all characteristics of the Enso pattern we call La Nina. La Nina is a cooling pattern. It means that the Pacific water is cooler than normal, and it creates a different weather pattern across the U.S. and in the entire world, really. Last winter, we had a lot of growth problems down in South America because of La Nina. La Nina is something, and I did a video talking about this before, but anytime the solar cycle ends and starts a new one, when that terminator event happens, I think there was a recent study by the NOAA that basically said that there was a 100% chance of going into La Nina. And if you look at the La Nina years and you match them up with terminator events in our solar cycle, you'll see that that happens to be the case. Another common occurrence, although it's not 100% guaranteed, but a common occurrence that we see with one La Nina is that it is often followed by another La Nina. And like I said, La Ninas are actually cooling patterns. And people don't think about this that much in the United States because here it tends to have an effect where it's a lot warmer on the West Coast, it's a lot drier on the West Coast, and we've got a lot of people out on the West Coast with large voices that say it's overheating, the world is ending. But what we're actually seeing with La Nina is a cooling pattern. The Pacific is cooling, it creates freezing temperatures in Europe. We've seen extremely cold temperatures in Europe. There's actually, in Brazil right now, we've seen the coldest temperatures in a century in Brazil. It's actually wiped out a lot of coffee trees. 75% of the world's coffee comes from Brazil. So if you drink coffee, you better stock up on some coffee beans because they're not going to be there next year. The freezes have literally wiped out a lot of the coffee trees and coffee plantations. But in the U.S. and in South America, yeah, you have drought conditions that affect crops. They affect things like soybeans and corn, but when you have dry and extreme droughts in areas like California, it also affects produce production. We've seen that people have to get rid of their livestock because there's not enough water for their livestock. We've seen the government tell farmers in New Mexico not to farm this year unless you're a big farmer because there's just not enough water for you. And we've started to see a lot of states squabble over water rights. We've seen lakes be completely depleted. And this is just 1 year of La Nina. All of these things that I'm talking about are 1 year of La Nina. We're expecting food shortages through the fall with produce because of La Nina. Imagine what would happen if you had back-to-back La Ninas. Well, that's exactly what is happening. And back-to-back La Ninas are relatively common. They're not 100%, but they do happen. And as we came out of La Nina in June this year, we've started to see the trend reverse back into La Nina again. And that's what a lot of the ENSO forecasts are calling for now. So if we go back into another La Nina, most of the winter forecasts I've seen up until this point have been calling for what we call a La Nada, or an ENSO neutral period, where it's just kind of in between. But within the last few weeks, I'd say the ENSO forecasts have fallen back into the La Nina category. Going into a La Nina winter for the second time is going to increase the drought conditions out west. It's not going to really give them much of a break. You're going to continue to see similar patterns to what we saw last year going into the spring. And as you know, the drought starts in the winter in the west. If you don't get enough snowfall, if you don't get enough winter precipitation, those lakes don't refill. You don't have any water on reserve. And so the La Nina going into the wintertime is already going to have its impact on the western United States. Unless we somehow come out of La Nina and just get a ton of rain early on. And right now it's looking like this new La Nina will last until about the same time it did this past year. When we look at South America, that also means that we're going back into a La Nina for them, which means that we're going to continue to see crops like soybeans and corn impacted. These are global crops that are traded around the world. And if their global supply starts to diminish, things start to happen, bad things start to happen. You and I, as U.S. consumers, when we buy products at the store and we're buying from corporations, we're buying from global corporations. Their job is to make a profit for their shareholders wherever they are. And I am 100% in favor of private corporations as long as they're not funded by any governments. And so their job is to sell to wherever they can sell to that's going to pay them the most. And so you and I, inadvertently, even with food grown here in the United States, we're in competition for our food from all the other sources around the world. The only ones that we're not in competition with globally on are our local food networks, where we're able to buy food locally. A lot of people don't like buying from farmers markets and stuff because it costs a lot of money. But if you let your local farmers go out of business, as this type of thing intensifies, it's just going to get worse. And I think it's going to intensify. I don't think it stops here. But having a second year of La Nina, a second year in a row, is going to further tighten our grain supplies globally. It's going to further tighten our cereal supplies globally, and it's going to create another issue for us when it comes to fresh produce next year. So we're going to see these shortages that we've seen this year intensify. When you have 2 years of drought, that drought's not necessarily going to match up in the same areas. So areas that you had extraordinary drought, those areas I actually think next year will probably shift further southwest, so a little further south than they were this past year, and they're going to have the same impacts that they had in destroying entire orchards wherever they go. We're probably going to see some of those intense winter breakouts in early spring, which impact crops. La Ninas are just, they're not good for growing. It's all over the USDA website. Everybody knows this. There are some areas of the U.S. that do benefit from La Ninas. Obviously in the south and the southeast, East Coast, you get a lot more moisture, so those areas do benefit. But we don't grow crops all over the U.S., not to the magnitude that we do, that we need, because we've kind of segregated out the areas where we grow and where we don't grow. And depending on how the La Nina falls, it may or may not impact the breadbasket. I mean, that's just, all of these things are things that will have to play out with time. But bottom line, it's going to be another year like it was this year. Now, there's a lot of people who try and forecast solar cycles. And I find this very interesting because I see how, the sun, like I was talking about, the Terminator event is what triggers these La Niñas. The sun plays a major role on our weather here on Earth and our climate. And the changes in the sun have massive impacts. And those changes aren't just, how many flares there are. The flares are just a symptom or a sign of other changes going on with the sun. A lot of what we're looking at is the electromagnetic energy that is coming from the sun to our Earth. There was actually an interesting study I read. It was a very old study where the guy was studying planetary alignments and predicted that he thought that we would hit the peak of the grand solar maximum in cycle 2022. He was right. I mean, we actually did peak out in 2020 in the solar cycle 22. And so that was an interesting study, but there's been some other studies in recent years where people like Valentina Zarkova have been able to look at other metrics of the sun and create fairly accurate forecasts. What they'll do is they'll back test them and then to see what their accuracy rating is, and then they'll test them going forward to see what the future could hold. And so we've already kind of seen NASA predict this solar cycle to be about equal with solar cycle 24, which was at 114. And if you watch a lot of different channels on YouTube, you heard people talking about solar cycle 24 and us heading into a grand solar minimum period. And then NASA came out with solar cycle 25 predictions that will probably max out at 115 sunspots. To give you an idea, I was just talking about solar cycle 22. That topped out well over a couple hundred sunspots at the peak of the solar cycle. So that's the activity of the sun was much higher in solar cycle 22 than it was in 23, especially much higher than 24. Another interesting fact that I just want to throw in here when it comes to NASA predictions is if you look at their predictions of solar cycle 24, they actually predicted that solar cycle to be much higher than solar cycle 23 initially. And then their predictions just slowly drop because as we progress into a new solar cycle, they're using that progression to help change their predictions. And so when you see a prediction at 115, I'm expecting that to be much lower by the time we're even midway through the solar cycle. And I'll get to why this matters in just a second, but I'm going to finish explaining to you why I think this solar cycle could be much lower than solar cycle 24. Zarkova's forecast shows that we would peak this solar cycle in 22 or 23. And at that time, the magnetic energy would start to drop. We would start to see a massive drop in total solar irradiance. And it would just kind of wobble out for the remainder of the solar cycle before we hit the next solar cycle, which would be almost dead as far as solar activity. And this is a disturbing forecast, not because we haven't seen it before, but because we have seen it before and we know what it can do. It can dramatically drop the temperatures of our Earth fairly quickly. And, we are concerned about 1.8 degrees of heating. This could also have the negative impact where it can drop us by a couple degrees. And maybe some of you don't understand what that means, but it would make a significant difference on temperatures on Earth, supposedly. I mean, that's a theory anyway, and it seems to match up with past solar cycles. The other change that it has is the sun's electromagnetic energy and how it interacts with the Earth is much different when it's in a quieter phase and when it's in a stronger phase. When it's in a quieter phase, we have a weaker protective field from the sun, which allows more cosmic energy, cosmic rays to enter into our atmosphere, which causes cloud seeding, and cloud seeding causes rain clouds and storms and precipitation. And there's a whole slew of impacts that it has. If you study the NAO, you recognize that the sun has influences, the patterns of the NAO, which is the North Atlantic Oscillation. It impacts the Arctic oscillations. It impacts, it obviously impacts the ENSO cycles. And so all of these things are extremely important to pay attention to. And what we have seen as far as this impact on ENSO cycles is that during periods of low solar activity, you tend to have more La Niñas than you do El Niños. And so that's another thing to consider because when we're talking about all these droughts and disruptions in our food supply, and we look at how we've set up our growing areas across our countries, we couldn't afford to handle even another year of La Nina, which we don't have a choice at this point. We're heading towards it. I guess we don't have a choice anyway, but we couldn't handle having more La Ninas. And I think that that is in the ultimate forecast, if Zarkova is correct. There's another scientist that I read who looked at the length of time of solar cycles, and I don't think that his analysis was that thorough, and I think it was somewhat selective to prove a hypothesis. It's amazing how many people do that. But he basically said that the longer the solar cycle, the weaker the next solar cycle. And the shorter the solar cycle, the stronger the next solar cycle. And that solar cycle 24 was very short, and so therefore we should expect a much stronger solar cycle 25. They even went on to say that one of the strongest solar cycles we've ever seen, which is theoretically incorrect. So these are all different studies, and people have many different theories on this stuff, and there are many different forecasts for it. I would say the consensus is that we have a weaker solar cycle 25. And if you really wanted to pay attention to it and know where you stand, if by 2025 we're seeing what Zarkova pointed out, then that means that we're heading into a very minimum period of solar activity. At the same time, if you are waiting until 2025 to have that confirmation before you start planting, before you start learning how to be self-sufficient, it's going to be a little late. You need to have yourself set up before then. Growing food isn't as simple as growing food to feed a family isn't as simple as buying a little raised bed and putting some seeds in it, expecting food to grow. We were joking about it the other day, how much food we get out of our garden versus feeding our entire family. Sometimes it's just not enough. We have to keep growing the size of our garden. And of course we have livestock. All of these things are necessary to sustain ourselves and our family. But it takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of learning. So if you're going to wait for that confirmation of where the solar cycle's headed, waiting until 2025 is going to be a little late. Anyway, so I think that 2022 is going to be kind of like one of those years of reckoning for people. They're going to start seeing these shortages for real. We're not going to be able to just push a spot shortage here and there, stop people from talking about it. It's going to be very well seen. We've seen shortages in restaurants. We've seen that kind of spread throughout the summertime. We've heard about the shortages in Q2 reports from large corporations, food manufacturers and producers, but we haven't seen it ourselves in the grocery stores, or at least we haven't noticed it because of the random spot shortages, the way that they move food around. But next year you're going to see it, you're going to notice it, you're going to feel it, so is everybody else. Now what happens when this happens is, well, we've seen what happens when this happens. When you look at Cuba and you look at South Africa, we can pin a lot of different reasons, a lot of different triggers for what has happened in those areas. But the fact is that these people have been starving. These people have had food insecurity for quite some time, even in areas of South America with migration. And when people have nothing left to lose where they are, they pack up and move, right? When people have nothing left to lose and they don't have a choice, then that's when they start to fight. They get up and they start to riot. They start to do the things that we've been seeing happening around the world. And that's what I think could happen if we run into a food crisis that is not easily solvable. And I don't think this is going to be easily solvable. I think everybody's still kind of running on the hopes that we're going to have a great crop year this year, which the numbers haven't really even looked that good. They've been looking weaker and weaker and weaker since 2018. And I think that people are hoping that we'll have a good crop year next year and we'll be able to kind of swing through this. China's not hoping. China's been buying up everything everybody puts out there. So, and if I were you, I would too. I would try and at least figure out how to supplement part of my food on my own. And again, go out and support your local farmers, your local food networks, because that's where you're going to have the most food security, is within your community. Depending on a globalized system is not providing you food security. These corporations are going to continue to have problems sourcing where their food comes from. And if they have problems sourcing ingredients, they're already having problems sourcing their ingredients. They're already having problems paying for the food. They've said it. They've warned their investors about it. And they've even started to increase their pricing even more to help offset and increase their margins. The next couple years are about what your abilities are to get things done, not theirs. And if you are growing food and you are on that path, make sure that you go ahead now and get everything you need for preserving food in the early fall when you start harvesting your gardens, because supplies have been tight, and when they come available, they're gone pretty quickly. So I'll try and do a search and see if I can find any when I post this video, and some links below. But as far as I know, everything's pretty scarce still. There are some books on Amazon where you can learn about some older food preservation tactics. I would suggest some of those: smoking meats, salting meats. You'll learn a lot from those. And you could also just use something as simple as olive oil to put your vegetables in. Anything that you can submerge the vegetables in, like an oil, that will keep the bacteria out, will help preserve some of your food. But don't take it from me, please. Take it from a preservation book, somebody who's researched it, published it, and is willing to accept that liability. Anyway, stay tuned. I hopefully will be able to get some more videos out to you shortly.